Welcome to Nuclear Pure Play, a Cameco produced podcast providing insight into the company and the nuclear energy industry. My name is Cory. I'm the Vice President of Investor Relations and Communications, and with me again here today is Grant Isaac, our President and Chief Operating Officer. Grant, we spent a few episodes now doing this podcast, and we've talked about a lot on the front end of the nuclear industry. We're talking about the fuel cycle itself, supply demand. We've gone into a conversation on the AP1000 and Westinghouse, but today I thought we'd talk about theme that's at the core of everything that we talk about when it comes to the business, which is our disciplined strategy. So that approach is very deliberate. So perhaps you could start us off with a few words on how we connect our contracting portfolio to our operating decisions, to our capital allocation decisions, and how does that all tie together under the disciplined strategy?
Our strategy is really articulated around those 3 points that we always put out there. We talk about marketing discipline, we talk about operating discipline, and we talk about financial discipline. And it's really important to think about how those work together. None of them are in isolation. We really focus on how this market performs, what its dynamics are, and we've already covered a couple of times the peculiarities of this market. A spot market that has zero fundamental demand, a term market that has a lot of uncovered requirement demand coming to the market, but we don't control when utilities bring that demand to the market. So we build homes for our production through our marketing strategy in a very disciplined way. We wait for the market to come to us. When we build those homes, we then call for the production required to source into those requirements. And ultimately, we have to have a financial strategy that is equally disciplined and allows us to be as patient, if not more patient, than our customers as they take time to come forward and contract for their needs. That is the way you build long-term value in the uranium business.
And we're very intentional about the way we use the word discipline. We don't do so casually. So what specifically does discipline mean in each one of those facets?
Yeah, if I start with the marketing side of it, it really is about taking what the market offers and not trying to chase the market demand if it isn't there. So folks have watched us over the years. We've been very careful with our marketing. We've been slow to contract. We're very deliberate when we contract, and we'll pull back volumes and reduce volumes when we contract, reflecting that discipline that we think this market has got more demand to bring, and we prefer when there's more demand in the market before we do a lot of contracting. That then means our operations have to go hand in glove. We often talk about we're in supply discipline in our operations. Right now, about 70% of our licensed, permitted production capacity is producing, and about 30% is either in a reduced form of production or it's in care and maintenance, because it does not make sense in this market to be producing material that isn't spoken for in a home, and then you're only left selling it into the spot market, which we've already said has no fundamental demand in it. So you've got to coordinate your marketing strategy with your operating strategy. And then people have watched, we've just been very conservative financially. We have a rock solid balance sheet because that balance sheet has to position us to be patient as the contracting evolves, be patient in terms of providing optionality to our future production and making investments, and then also being opportunistic in a market where we think there's growing value for nuclear assets. And I would say the Westinghouse acquisition was a perfect example of being rewarded for having such a strong, disciplined financial strategy as well.
Okay, so a big part of that discipline is the way we talk about the market. And we have a previous episode where we talked about how spot is not the market. I think it's worth reiterating because that is pretty fundamental discussion. So we could bring that back to the conversation.
It is pretty fundamental. What we often say is that spot market exposure, meaning producing from uranium assets that do not have a home, is really a value destructive strategy. The reason it's value destructive is for the reasons we've talked about before. There is zero fundamental in-year demand for uranium. There is not a reactor on the planet that is loading a fuel bundle in the next 12 or in fact next 18 months that hasn't already procured the uranium and already put it into the processes required to have that bespoke fuel bundle ready for that reactor. So what it means is you have a spot market where it's all discretionary. It's discretionary purchases by the utilities. It can be discretionary purchases by producers. It's a heck of a lot of trader to trader churn in the spot market. And ultimately, if you show up with pounds that have no home, you create this double negative. First of all, you've shown up, you obviously need to sell it. So those who might be willing buyers step back to find out how desperate you are to sell. But because it's produced material, it also creates the echo that you're going to show up in a couple more months when you have more production and do the same thing again. So it tends to be value destructive for those with producing assets as they try to jam material into a market that has no fundamental demand. So we say spot market exposure is a bad strategy. Spot price exposure through a term contract built with appropriate floors and ceilings, commitments out into the future, very good strategy for creating long-term value in uranium.
Okay, so one area that we hear from investors and other stakeholders frequently is how does that discipline strategy translate to our operating decisions in terms of where does tier 1 fit, where does tier 2 fit, where does greenfield potentially fit in the future?
One of the really good things about building a long-term contract home is that we know well in advance, in fact, several years in advance, when we need that production. Our typical term contract, we wouldn't start first deliveries for 2, usually 3 years. We always have a head start in our planning when we think about where we're going to get more production from. So right now, while we're in supply discipline, we have a couple of things going on. One is in anticipation of more demand coming to the market, we think about spending sustaining and replacement capital at assets like McArthur River and Key Lake with an eye to the future, with an eye to the optionality to go to 25 million pounds when the time is right, when the demand is in the market. Right now, the demand isn't there, so we're being very cautious, we stay disciplined and we stay deliberate, but we always have line of sight to get our assets ready for the homes that we've already built, the demand that's already come to us. We're never left chasing the market with urgent supply decisions, trying to jam capital and people out of sight just to get it a little bit more production in a spot market spike. That is not the way to do it in our industry. So operations follows that lead of where the market homes are, and that ultimately follows the lead of where utilities demand is and when they feel like bringing it to the market.
And so we say time and time again, we're long-term market, long-term focused. We often get questions asking if we're a bit asleep at the wheel and don't have a pipeline, we don't have a view to how our mines and our future may look in terms of things that could come online. Could you take just a moment to talk about the pipeline and what's in the future for Cameco?
Yeah, we're pretty excited about the pipeline that we have for uranium, but we've been through all of the contracting cycles in this industry. We've seen them all. And some folks will remember years ago, we had a W strategy. And that strategy was to go from 20 million pounds of annual uranium production to 40 million pounds. And what we did in a market that was up and to the right, this was pre-Fukushima, it was a nuclear renaissance. There was so much going on in our industry, and everybody started to make the assumption that it would always be up and to the right. And we built a very specific view to when that pipeline would come on. We had this wonderful Gantt chart that had all of our production, all of our projects, and we had a list of when it was all going to come on. And what we did is we created complacency in the market. We created a sense where fuel buyers looked at our public disclosures and said, well, Cameco's is going to double production and they don't have homes for it, so this sounds like a good time for me to wait and contract later. We've learned the lesson. So yes, we have tremendous optionality in our future supply, but it's not our job to solve the problem of the supply-demand gap. So when we look at it, we start with terrific exploration land package, the biggest in the Athabasca Basin, most of it adjacent to brownfield infrastructure. Then we look to our tier ones. We've already made the decision to extend Cigar Lake. We have the ability to go to 25 million pounds at McArthur River, Key Lake, if the time is right, if the demand is there. We haven't made that decision yet. If the market is bringing more demand and better terms and conditions, then Cameco and Kazatomprom are probably united in wanting JV Inkai to produce not just at its license capacity, but maybe take advantages of abilities to flex up. That's just our tier 1 assets, Cory. On top of that, we have tier 2 assets, our Rabbit Lake mine, in care and maintenance in Canada, mine and mill. We have US mines, very coveted US origin supply, again in care and maintenance, waiting for the market to come back. These are just simply restarting brownfield assets as opposed to the challenge and the time required to bring on greenfield. And then after those tier 2s would be brought back, then we would start to contemplate a couple of different things. One is greenfield in the form of probably a greenfield mine adjacent to existing milling infrastructure, because I think most people forget that the critical path item to uranium mining is actually the mill. So taking advantage of mills that already exist is really important. But also remember our GLE project to be deployed in the United States right now is focused on depleted UF6 tails, re-enriching them back up to natural UF6. And we often say, well, that's like a 4 to 5 million pound uranium mine disguised as a 2,000 ton conversion plant that's already above ground. We just have walked through a very quick suite of assets that are already at our disposal. It doesn't require any acquisitions, and actually we're not even really talking about deploying greenfield dollars at this point. So a lot of optionality, but you're sure not going to see us put out a Gantt chart to say specifically how we're going to double production.
And add to that all the excitement across our best-in-class exploration portfolio across northern Saskatchewan. An exciting time for Cameco. If you want more information on Cameco, on our strategy, on the background of this conversation, please visit cameco.com.